Bright boy, I will admit you are pretty clever. But if I took this hammer here and I bashed in your skull with it, you would have the same 3 dimples in the same place as old Ben.
Django, you must face another day.
Hans Leder, Stephen, Tex Watson, and many other villains have starred in Tarantino's films, but they all don't compare to Calvin Candie. In this critique, I will be splitting it up into 3 parts. Our introduction to Calvin, Calvin's cold stare, and in my opinion, the best scene that Tarantino has ever written, the dinner table scene. We are introduced to Calvin with him watching 2 of the slaves that he has invited fight to the death for just his sick and twisted enjoyment. And then Django, our hero of the story, comes in and shocks Calvin with him being a free black man, a man of which Calvin has never seen in his entire sheltered life. He then proceeds to watch again the fight of the 2 slaves and watches his slave win, and with his sadistic ways celebrates the victory like a fan celebrating the World Cup being won. Later in the scene, Calvin celebrates his slave's win and meets his worst nightmare, Django. And after his brief encounter with Django, he doesn't really get who he is and what he is doing there, but Calvin is still quite stirred about what is happening and has never seen a free black man at his bar, let alone within 5 meters of him. So from minute 1 with his confrontation with Django, Calvin feels like he is on the back foot and has met his match in Django and shows him some appreciation. Further on in the scene, with coconut in hand, Calvin proceeds to further his confrontation with Django, as Django tells the man that him and Schultz that they do not want one of Monsieur Condé's terrible fighters, which brings Calvin to near enough boiling point, but due to Leo's incredible acting, you can always see it on Calvin's face, but he never blows up and flips his lid.
You had my curiosity, but now you have my attention.
In a scene yet again proving how great of a character Calvin is, he can simply turn any situation intense with just a simple build-up of dialogue. He builds the tension and fear with a combination of his facial expressions and body language, all based around an old slave fighter who doesn't want to fight for Calvin anymore. Calvin then proceeds to make said fighter feel tiny in his own body, with him proceeding to talk about how he spent $500 on a fighter and expects them to participate in at least 5 fights, and then for them to play dead. But in this case, the fighter has retired after only 3 fights, so Calvin proceeds to tear the man down limb by limb, word by word. Before Calvin decides to punish said fighter, he makes sure to lock eyes with Django and truly assert himself as the main man, with a stare-off ensuing between the two that lasts for at least 10 seconds.
There's old Ben.
In quite possibly Quentin Tarantino's greatest ever scene, we see Calvin alongside his secretary, Django and Dr. Schultz at the dinner table, listening to Calvin's spiel about the slaves that he has owned before, his 3 champion fighting slaves, and then describes the 3 dimples that you can see apparently in a slave's skull.
Notice 3 distinct dimples. Here, here, and here.
The dinner then escalates from a cohesive and well-mannered Calvin to an enraged psycho, finally blowing his lid and flipping out.
Your palm flat on that tabletop! If you lift those palms off that turtle shell tabletop, Mr. Pooch is gonna let loose with both barrels of that sawed off.
While Calvin tells the pair to sit back down, he smashes a glass on the table in a fit of rage which was entirely unscripted and was real, which caused Leo to really need stitches in his hands. But I'm getting off track. Anyway, Calvin then tells his secretary to collect the guns from Django and Schultz's waist to truly establish himself as the main alpha in the room, with only his men holding the guns in the room. Calvin then returns with blood dripping from his hand to the official business matter of Django and Dr. Schultz buying back Django's wife, Brunhild. Then, Calvin grabs Brunhild by the neck and sits her down forcefully. All attention in the room then focuses to the true business matter at hand of Brunhilde's purchase for $12,000, which Dr. Schultz is again quite nervous to really cough up the money for Brunhilde, until Calvin then smears Brunhilde's face with the blood from his hand and plant her face directly onto the turtle shell table and put the hammer that was synonymous with the death of slaves at Candyland towards Brunhilde's neck and examine the 3 dimples inside of the slave skulls. Meanwhile, Calvin never looks away from Django and Schultz while threatening to kill Brunhilde. This scene then ends with Schultz coughing up the money for Brunhilde and then, therefore, concluding one of Quentin Tarantino's greatest scenes ever. Overall, even with 38 minutes on screen, the 38 minutes of Calvin Candie's presence is one to remember. From his incredible dinner table scene to Calvin staring out Django, Calvin Candie will go down in Tarantino's filmography, and possibly any director's filmography, as the best villain that has ever been written.